Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a very warm welcome to the latest in our series of Doha Debates, coming to you from the Gulf state of Qatar and sponsored by the Qatar Foundation. Back in October 2001, it seemed to Britain and America like a perfect plan. Bomb al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, end the drug trafficking, and help to install and support a new democratic government. But it didn't work out that way. Nearly 9 years later, Western forces are bogged down in an increasingly bitter war with the Taliban. Democratic elections have been tainted by widespread fraud. The narcotics trade and corruption have proved endemic. Now, many voices in the West are expressing the view contained in our motion tonight. This House believes this Afghan government is not worth fighting for. But what do you think? Our panel brings a high level of expertise from inside and outside Afghanistan. Speaking for the motion, Peter Galbraith, a former UN envoy to Afghanistan, who says the UN covered up election fraud in the country. Alongside him, Mirwaz Yassini, first Deputy Speaker of the lower house of the Afghan Parliament. Last year, he ran a brief and unsuccessful campaign for the presidency. Against the motion, Shukriya Barakzai, one of only a handful of female members of the Afghan Parliament and a prominent women's rights campaigner. And with her, Lawrence Korb, defense analyst and former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. So now let me call first on Peter Galbraith to speak for the motion, please.
Thank you. President Hamid Karzai has been in office in Afghanistan for 8 years. And those 8 years have been characterized by ineffectiveness, toleration of corruption, a deteriorating security situation. And this year, he begins a new term in office as a result of an election that was massively fraudulent. Of the 3 million votes that were cast for Hamid Karzai in the last election, EU monitors say that at least 1 million were phony. Based on my experience with the United Nations, monitoring and supporting the elections, we noted that in parts of the country, including Kandahar, the second largest province, fewer than 10% of the people actually voted, while returns were reported in the range of 30% for Kandahar city, up to over 100% in some of the outlying districts. Now, a government that is corrupt, ineffective, that cannot manage the security situation is one that does not merit support. One that is in office by fraud is one that does not merit support. But my argument does not depend on the rights or wrongs of the Karzai administration. Rather, it depends on the prospects for success. The United States and its allies are engaged in a counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan. For that counterinsurgency campaign to work, the United States and its allies need a credible local partner. When US and allied troops go into a district, it can clear the district of the Taliban. But then it needs Afghan army to provide security, Afghan police to provide law and order, and most importantly, an Afghan government that can provide honest administration, public services, and that can win the support of the people.
Peter Galbraith, thank you very much indeed. The logic of your position seems to be that you want the troops to leave until there's a government that is more acceptable to NATO. Is that right?
No, but I don't believe that sending additional troops makes sense. Remember, troops...
But you want them to keep fighting, the troops that are there.
I think there are things that can be done in parts of the country to keep the situation from getting even worse.
But by staying and fighting, they're supporting the remit of the Karzai government, aren't they? They're reinforcing the remit of that government.
No, I think, and this motion, I think it's very important. This motion is not saying that Afghanistan is not worth fighting for.
No.
The motion is that this House believes that the Karzai government, is not worth fighting for. But
there is no other government.
Well, and in those circumstances, additional troops, as part of a counterinsurgency strategy, which involves having a credible local partner, cannot accomplish their mission.
But this is the government, however ineffective, however corrupt, however it fails to meet your expectations or the expectations of the West, it's the one they voted for, albeit there was massive fraud. But President Karzai would have won anyway, wouldn't he, even if there hadn't been fraud?
Tim, you cannot say that a government that is in office by massive fraud is a legitimate government. And this is not an issue.
Would he have lost the election?
This is not an,
Would he have lost the election?
Possibly. We don't know. What we know is that the election commission that he appointed helped perpetrate a fraud in which there were at least 1 million phony ballots.
But what do you expect in a country which has gone through what Afghanistan... It's hard enough to get a fair election in the United States,
This is condescending toward the people of Afghanistan. That people of Afghanistan are capable of holding elections, and in fact, parts of the campaign, of the election campaign, were very impressive. What I'm opposed to is a military mission that cannot be achieved. Remember, these are young men and women that are putting their lives at risk. This is an enterprise that is costing tens of billions of dollars. And if the mission cannot be accomplished because there isn't a credible partner, because the partner is seen as illegitimate, not just internationally, but by a large segment of the Afghan people.
Peter McGalbraith, thank you very much indeed. Could I ask now, please, Shukriya Barakzai to speak against the motion?
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thanks God that the legitimacy of Afghan government is not coming from the address of Mr. Peter Galbraith, a former deputy envoy from the United Nations for Afghanistan. It's coming from the Afghan vote. It's coming from the Afghan population. It's coming with the international identity, which is they sent the congratulation messages for the Afghan people and Afghan president. At the meantime, he is legitimate. Not only once, 3 times President Karzai got legitimacy. Number one, when it was during the 8 years, as you mentioned, when it was a temporary Loy-Jirga, he got vote. The second time, first presidential election, which is Afghans practicing democracy. And the second was the second election, which is everybody just only talking about the fraud on election. You will never understand how it's difficult for Afghans to pay their own life for practicing democracy with the name of election. There was a lot of casualties among our police, among our civilians, and there are lots of people putting their own life in risk to succeed these procedures. At the meantime, the government, when you say and blame that they failed, they are not successful, and they are corrupt. Over the 5 million refugees right now, over the 5 million, 3 million are in Afghanistan right now, which is they come from Iran and Pakistan, Afghans living abroad. Today we have 7 million children which is going to the school. From 2002, we have 0 police, 0 number of national police and national army. But today, just only the number of our police is 160,000 with a uniform, with a responsibility. We are a young government to doing lots of job at once, state building, nation building, counter narcotics, counter corruption, and making a government.
Could you come to a close, please?
Don't forget that the part of the government was complete, in fact, 4 years before.
Thank you very much indeed. Nobody disputes that the Afghan people have paid a high price and that they've suffered a lot, but 7 years into the reconstruction process, you're having millions of Afghans suffering human rights violations, and the government apparently not very interested in that either. Why?
Yeah,
Why? Why?
Because when the Bonn Agreement was made...
And they're worth fighting for, people who couldn't care less about human rights?
No. Silent majority in Afghanistan, they want justice. We want access for the justice. We want the implementation of human rights.
Amnesty International says many Afghans are expressing frustration and anger at the Afghan government's apparent indifference towards human rights, the blatant impunity of those suspected of serious human rights violations and war crimes, lack of accountability for government personnel. And you think the mothers of Western soldiers should send their sons to protect a government that has no interest in human rights violations
I'm sure those lives, which is they are paying in Afghanistan, we really appreciate and deep condolences with their own family, which is they are young
But a
girls
government
and
that
boys in
allows these
Afghanistan.
things to go on and shows no interest in correcting them is worth foreign armies dying for?
I do believe, first of all, they come for their own national security in Afghanistan. We suffered before 2001 as well, but no one listened to us.
And why a president who releases drug dealers? He released five major drug dealers last year. Why? If he's interested in correcting the situation, why is he releasing drug dealers? What's the point of having a military operation?
Show me at least 5 drug leaders which will be arrested in international market. If they cannot control their own street from the drug supply for their own young, how they can ask us to control over our country from not having opium? I'm against that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now please let me ask Miraz Yassini to speak for the motion.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for having me in Doha Debates. Well, I would like to begin. Political phrases cannot be abstractly translated or interpreted. I would like to make a differentiation between the process, the democracy, people of Afghanistan, and the government. Indeed, the current government is ineffective. There is no doubt. That is a failed government, and we cannot go with this government as it is since 2001. There is no security, there is a corruption, there is no reconciliation, there is no services for the Afghan citizen, and particularly everything on the democracy remained just a slogan. We did not work on the democracy or for the democracy, but we in due course slaughtered the democracy by introducing the false and fraudulent election to the Afghan. So we are establishing a very dirty precedent from the point of democracy for the Afghan future. I would like to say that some part of the government is functioning. The international community should work for those parts which is functioning, but we have to have a very close eyes because the international community and the Afghan citizens are sailing the same boat. Even it does go beyond our borders to the neighbors into the region. So if cannot be improved, we cannot afford the failure, and the failure is there with the current Afghan government.
You say democracy is just a slogan, Mirwais Yassini, but it enabled you to take part in presidential elections in a region where there have been precious few elections. You didn't win, but you were able to take part. Isn't that an achievement? That happened under this president's watch.
Well, we are establishing democracy in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
A bad and worse start is good.
And a large number of Afghans feel that things are getting better. The latest poll, BBC, ABC poll, says 68% think it's getting better.
We are hoping to be better. I'm also hopeful that things will get better, but it does not mean it is going correct.
Would you have done any better on corruption?
Well, I'm sure.
You've been president?
If I've been president, my first action will be just to work on corruption, just to stop the corruption.
Easy to say. I wanted to see what you'd do about corruption, so I had a look on your website, and it says, in my government, the law of the land will be supreme. Brothers and relatives officials won't be able to sign agreements and get lands. The parliament and judiciary will be independent. Easy to say. How are you going to bring all that about?
Well, I would like to start...
You were short on methods.
I would like to have started for myself. I would have not let my brothers just practice everything for them. Trade, monopoly, oil, and just appointing the governors. I would not have done, and I would not have let my brothers to be in my government more powerful than myself.
And one of the big achievements, surely, of President Karzai in his time in office is that he doesn't have it all his own way. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks, he has a parliament that can reject his ministerial appointments. That is also a sign of democracy. That's not a slogan either, is it?
Well, we have to go for...
So give the man some credit. Maybe that's worth fighting for.
Well, I mean, the government did not... Lately, the government did not interfere in the parliament. We are not discrediting, and we have to go good.
It's a little more than not interfering with the parliament. It's part of a democratic process we're seeing in action,
there were deals inside the parliament, in the parliament world.
Well, there are deals inside every parliament, aren't there?
But those deals, sometimes the deals are legal and according to democratic rules, but sometimes it does go beyond the limits of the democracy.
Yeah, but give him some credit. It's a recognizable process.
Well, we would, for the last cabinet rejection that the government did not interfere in the parliament, and he sent his second batch, hopefully he will not interfere again in the parliament. Right. And we have to credit the government in the ministers, in some of the ministers for...
Okay, so something's worth fighting for.
Yes.
Mirwais Yassini, thank you very much indeed. Now let me please ask Lawrence Korb to speak against the motion.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think this government is worth fighting for because it's supported by the people. Tim mentioned the latest poll that was done not just by BBC, but also ABC, an American company, and a German company. And if you look at that poll, the vast majority of people in Afghanistan think the government's on the right track. They're satisfied with the results of the recent election, and they trust President Karzai to improve security and economic conditions. And nearly 80% have a favorable view of the International Security Assistance Force. It's also better than the alternative. Only 7% of the people in Afghanistan support the Taliban. Only 4% want them back. 58% think that the Taliban is the great threat to the future of Afghanistan, and 70% are very glad that the international force got him out of power. Remember, when we talk about government, it's not just Karzai. It's been mentioned earlier that you have a parliament. And I think it's a great step forward that the parliament turned down 17 of the 24 cabinet appointees that President Karzai set up. You also have the beginning of a civil society. You've got a free press. Does it have a lot of problems? It does. But a lot of the problems are caused by, and I'll speak primarily for the United States, we went in without thinking about what the long-term goal was going to be. We partnered with the warlords, and then, of course, we left them in power. President Karzai had to deal with them. I'm very confident that with the increased troops, not only from the United States, but with the International Security Force, International Security Assistance Force, we can get the security situation under control, and I think then that you'll begin to see the government improve. Final comment, remember that not every government is perfect. If you look at the Freedom House Index, and you'll see they rank democracies. One of the countries they rank high as a democracy is the Philippines. They also rank them very high when it comes to corruption. Thank you.
Lawrence Korb, thank you very much indeed. We always hear that America goes to war to protect its values abroad, to fight for its values. I'm wondering what values are embodied by a government that allows millions of people's human rights to be violated and is seemingly indifferent to that fact? Well, what values are you protecting there?
The United States obviously wants to uphold its values, but as you can go back to the Second World War, we had to partner with the Soviet Union to defeat a greater evil in Nazi Germany, and here I think we're partnering with this government to defeat.
But that was hardly a fledgling government, was it?
It was.
The Soviet Union had been around for a long time.
But you're talking about our values that we uphold, but basically when you have to do things, it's a complicated issue. It's a complicated
issue, but if you're fighting for this government, what's the message to the rest of the world? That you'll support any old human rights abuser as long as it's your human rights abuser?
The message is that this government has to clean up its act because it doesn't have a blank check, and that's why I'm very happy that President Obama, when he had the troop increase, also talked about a deadline to begin getting out, and basically saying if you don't shape up, then we're going to have to reconsider.
But it starts to sound a little bit lame, doesn't it, after a while? You keep on repeating that. The narcotics trade keeps on flourishing, corruption, no sign that the judiciary or the police were seeing any improvements there whatsoever. How long are you going to go on? You say it's not a blank check.
I think we've finally given it the attention that it deserves. The Bush administration was of a dereliction of duty when it came to Afghanistan, not only not sending enough troops, but not providing the aid that they promised.
Isn't the danger, though, continuing to fight for this government becomes counterproductive? You stir up extremists, you get new recruits to
again,
Al-Qaeda.
I think if you
Your drones kill a lot of civilians, don't they?
I think if you ask the Afghan people, they're very much in favor of what the United States and its partners are doing.
All right, Lawrence Korb, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're going to throw this issue now open to the audience. The motion, this House believes this Afghan government is not worth fighting for. We're going to take some questions. The gentleman in the front row, you, sir, please.
Thank you. I'm from Bangladesh, and my question is to the two of you who are against the motion. Why aren't you saying, isn't there more resistance against foreign troops? Why don't you speak up and say, we don't want foreign troops coming up. We are against the surge. That voice is not coming out.
For sure, Afghanistan never want to be host long for foreign troops, any troops from any country. This is the history of Afghanistan. This is our nature. But right now, for the time, till we are a little baby, till we want to stand on our own feet, we need him, unfortunately, if we like or not. At the meantime, let me say another thing.
Just one thing.
We are against any other action, starting from civilian casualties, searching house, and other things which is against our tradition, custom, constitution, and all international conventions in Afghanistan, which is most of the time the international troops are doing.
Okay, Lawrence Cole.
I think it's important to keep in mind the United States does not intend to be occupying another colonial power. We want to get out of there. And a lot of people did not believe we would ever leave Iraq. We withdrew from the cities on the 30th of June. We're going to be out completely by the end of 2011 because the Iraqi government asked us to do that.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the gentleman in the fourth row there. You, sir.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm from Afghanistan, and my question goes to the proposition side of the motion. You supported the process. You supported the government. You were standing. You means the organization was standing with Hamid Karzai, supporting him throughout the process. But now, at the end, you're leaving him alone. You supported the government. And tell me, what's UN doing about the civilian casualties there?
Thank you for that question. The United Nations engaged in its own severe dereliction of duty in Afghanistan. It was charged by the Security Council to support the Afghan electoral institutions in the holding of honest elections. And it simply gave, the head of the mission, simply gave a blank check to the Afghan electoral institutions. The Independent Election Commission was the body that carried out the fraud. In every instance where fraud took place, its staff was in one way or another complicit. I disagreed with the head of the mission. I said that the UN had a responsibility to promote honest elections. At various stages in this process, I tried to take steps to have honest elections, including to close polling centers where there were going to be no voters, the so-called ghost polling centers, and to get the Election Commission to stay with its procedures. In the end, there were protests against me from the Afghan government, and I was removed. And since I was removed, I have been speaking out about the problem.
Okay, you want to come back on?
What I have heard, you were not removed. You said yourself that you just resigned. That you had some problems.
Let me just put an end to that. I did not resign. I was fired for having raised the issue of fraud in UN-funded and UN-supported elections. I find that to be quite extraordinary.
Okay, let me ask you, where are you on the issue of the Afghan government? Is it worth fighting for from your point of view?
Afghan government could do better. But I cannot blame Afghan government. I cannot blame the Karzai. Karzai came to a ruin. There was no country, nothing. There was no government. I think I appreciate his efforts in bringing the country together. And I have one comment to Mr. Yassini.
Well, he's got one for you as well. Okay,
just one question. You were a part of the government. I believe in 2005 and 4. You were one of the high-ranking members in the Ministry of Interior. You were dealing with drug trafficking and these kind of issues. And I remember that drug trafficking was dramatically increasing those times. What have you done about corruption? What have you done about trafficking? And why are you leaving the government if you want to fight it?
I think that's enough questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I was not official of the Interior Ministry. I was in charge of the Counter-Narcotics Policy Division. Yeah. And at that time, if you go back, you're very right in dating. But there's a little bit misunderstanding that the opiate at that era was down, 25% decrease was made when I was director of the counter-narcotic in Afghanistan.
So you're saying you did a good job?
So why didn't you stay in the government if you were doing a good job?
Pardon?
Because we needed you in the country. Why didn't you stay in the government?
Well,
you went to the parliament and you started an opposition against the government?
I did want to go to the parliament to be the true voice of the people, and I achieved it. I've decided, and the people encouraged me to go and leave the government in that ship which was going, and I couldn't take that responsibility if the government is run since 2004, 2005, up to now.
Okay, I'm going to take another question from the gentleman in the third row there. You, sir.
Good evening. I'm the ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan here in Doha. My question actually goes to Mr. Galbraith, who was recently removed, or as he indicated, fired from the UN, and also Mr. Yossini, a presidential candidate that only won, let me say, won 0.9% of the votes in this last democratically elected election.
Okay, could we have a question, please?
Now, the alternative, what sort of alternatives did you provide us? What, instead of this current government, I have not heard a viable alternative or solution.
Okay, Peter Galbraith.
Mr. Ambassador, I think that you've raised a very good point. One possibility would, of course, be to rerun the elections. That would require a genuinely independent election commission, and it's hard to see how that might take place. But there is an alternative in Afghanistan of having a loya jirga, which might in the end be able to produce some power-sharing arrangements. Part of the problem in Afghanistan is you have one of the world's most diverse countries, both ethnically and geographically, and yet one of the world's most centralized political systems. It doesn't work. So as an alternative, and this has been proposed by Afghans, and it's a decision I want to emphasize for Afghans, not foreigners to make, but one alternative would be to have power sharing, as exists in many countries, with a prime minister and cabinet chosen by the parliament, and with elected local government on the provincial level with real powers, legislative and budget powers.
Would you like to reflect on that? He's telling you that your government isn't worth fighting for, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, we have to understand the contextual constraints right now in Afghanistan. Holding a loya jirga, I think at this moment is it's null and void. Realizing that almost 6 million people went to the voting booths and voted. So this is your perspective and that's your opinion. The stats you've given me, I can reject those stats.
6 million people didn't vote. I mean, at least 1 million, probably more of those votes were fraudulent.
Okay, I'm going to go back to, there's a lady's hand right up there. You've had your hand up for a long time.
So I'm originally from Afghanistan, and like a lot of people, I think the only hope for my country is democracy. Considering Western democracies, which took centuries to establish themselves, shouldn't we give Afghanistan more than 5 years to establish its democracy?
Yes, Cindy.
First of all, ages are needed to establish the democracy in Afghanistan. But your concern and my concern and the concern of the Afghans are that we just establish a good democracy. The foundation has to be solid. The foundation has not to be fraudulent. And I completely agree that we have to give it time, but when we begin and when we move in the very beginning steps, it has to be very transparent and clean. And I do agree with you. Thank you.
Okay, Shukriya Barakzai.
Yeah. I agree with you there. Democracy is not a product, it's always process. And this process needs decades, generations. And we are...
Why does it have to have decades and generations? Why?
How long takes democracy for your country to be established?
Well, the world was in a very different state then.
It's not different.
The world's much more connected now.
It's the same. It's the same. How long it takes for a United States to establish democracy, to having state?
I think you're selling the Afghan people short. The Afghan people are fully capable of democracy. The issue in this election was not about whether Afghans could have democracy. It was whether the votes could be counted honestly.
I'm really
sorry. And that's very simple.
You're sticking with the election. But when I'm talking about democracy, it means equal rights, freedom of expression or free press. It means rule of law, the implementation of human rights, equal access for justice, delivering social service for the people, having, let's say, freedom for political parties. These all values we survived and share powering check and balance system.
Okay.
It's all democracy, not only the election that you came for a few months in Afghanistan, and after that, I'm sorry for your job that you lost, but it's not the fault of Afghans. It is the fault of your institution.
We tend to confuse too often elections with democracy. They are not, okay? It's civil society that you have to build, and that's the key thing. Even if you had a perfect election, unless you had built civil society, free press, independent judiciary, independent parliament, it's not going to work. And I think if you take a look, not only did they turn down several of the ministers that Karzai proposed, but he appointed 7 really good ones. If you take a look at things like finance, education, agriculture, these are really good people. So I think you're moving in the right direction.
Okay, gentleman in the 5th row up there.
Hello, I'm Qatari. I want to ask what makes the Afghan government a legal government, since Taliban didn't take a part in it and there's a fraud in the election?
Yes,
Well, the Taliban did not get a part in it because you could not get a part in it. Number one, I have to admit that. We're looking since ages, and still there is a slogan of reconciliation. Nobody did bother about the reconciliation with the Taliban. We don't have any institution. And that's what we are trying to say, that this government needs to be improved in order to get to the reconciliation with the Taliban.
Legal government, is it?
I do believe that Taliban also is those whom they are Afghan. They are part of the country and they have equal rights according to constitution that I have. It's also depend on them. I think one question is always in my mind. They are not accepting the all legitimate procedure which start from 2001 till today. It not means that they didn't participate in the election. I will tell you, there was a guy which is former Taliban governor. He was also standing for the presidential election, and he also got a good number of the vote. And also we have in our system some Taliban, which is they are elected by the people. They are the reality and they are the truth. But it not means because the legitimacy is not coming from their address. They are as a civilian, they are as a people, they can join all democratic procedures, but not with the violence, not with the crime, not with the suicide attack.
Okay, gentleman in the 3rd row.
My name is Hashmat Musli, I'm from Afghanistan. You talked about values, and I would like to talk about values. To win peace, you must wage peace. It's a plagiarism, it's not my quote, I forgot who said it. But you seem to have a schizophrenic political stance. From one point, you are saying that the country is in such a mess, we need more troops.
Who are you addressing that to?
The camp that is for more bloodshed. You are saying that the country is in such a mess, we need more blood because we've done a good job. I get surprised.
Lawrence Korb, do you want to take
And when the getting goes tough, I'm sure that those who have double passports will flee Afghanistan, like past prime ministers and past ministers.
Yeah,
they left Afghanistan. Where is the former minister for finance?
Okay, you've had your question. Lawrence Korb.
I think a lot of American and coalition forces are dying. 520 died last year. 15 have already died in 2010. And they're dying to give the Afghans the opportunity to choose their own destiny. We have no interest in running Afghanistan, being like the Soviets or like the British when they came. We're interested in helping the Afghan people make their own choices. And they have a limited amount of time. And they're going to have to basically, their future is in their hands. After a couple of years, we will have done all that we can. Now, we also have a national security interest in it. We do not want to see, and we is not just the United States. Remember, there's 45 other countries there, okay, that are concerned that if the Taliban should come back or should there be chaos there, it could spread all throughout the region. We haven't mentioned it, but the whole question of what happens in Pakistan if Afghanistan collapses.
Okay.
The Taliban is not going to come back. Let's be clear. The Taliban is an entirely Pashtun movement. Afghanistan is only 45% Pashtun. It has no support among the other communities, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks. And so as long as there's some support for the non-Taliban elements, which also include many Pashtuns, they are not going to come back. The Taliban in Pakistan is also basically a Pashtun movement. The Pashtuns are at most 15% of Pakistan. They're not going to take over Pakistan. which incidentally is a much more stable country with institutions than a lot of people are giving it credit for. So let's have some realistic perspective on what's at stake here.
Okay,
well, I would like to have, first of all, a point with my co-speaker and then a point with Lawrence.
Can we make them brief? We have a lot of questions
very brief.
out there.
I'll try to my best. First of all, Taliban coming, I mean, don't try this chance. Don't jump out of the plane without parachute. If the foreign forces are not there, the Americans are not there, Taliban will make it very easy to come back and conquer or to attack Kabul. So don't underestimate the enemy, number one.
So the government is worth fighting for then?
Well, the process is worth fighting. The government itself is a problem.
The process is embodied in the government, isn't it?
Well, whatever is it that does go, the ball goes back to the courtyard of the United States and our Western allies there. Because my second point was maybe answer of your current point to Lawrence, that don't support the drugs lord, don't support the corruption, don't support the bad governance. Please do support the democracy, justice in Afghanistan, in valuing your sacrifices.
Lawrence Court, you want to answer that point?
I think we are, because President Obama has made it very clear to President Karzai, if he continues to do the things that you're talking about, the international community is not going to continue to help him. He's got a limited. Don't forget that a lot of the problems that you're talking about were caused by the fact that we went in there, created a vacuum, and then walked away. And that's part of the problem that you have. In my view, it was criminal for what the United States did by going in and then ignoring the place. President Bush promised a Marshall Plan to the people in Afghanistan and never followed up. So what do you, Ambassador Galbraith is right. They might be 15% of the population, but the people will go with them if they're afraid, like they did back in the 90s.
So we are just waiting the result on the ground.
Okay, Shukriya Barak.
Yeah. I was one of the optimistic Afghans when the United States came after Taliban. But when they came, they say, we will provide and support democracy and there will be Marshall Plan. What was the Marshall Plan? They jumped to the Iraq. They leave Afghanistan because they believe the chapter is closed. This is the final. But today, again, they come back and again, they are paying triple.
Okay.
Why? Why?
Just
because
finish, please.
They didn't invest on the infrastructure in Afghanistan. They didn't listen to the silent majority in Afghanistan. They support, again, wrong people for wrong process.
Okay, lady in the second row.
I'm from Sudan, and my question is for the proposition. The alternatives that you proposed were rerunning elections and power sharing, both of which need voting and which need also like people to vote. So if the presidential elections, as you said, were unfair and were filled with corruption, what makes you think that these alternatives will be any better?
Peter Galbraith, this was your idea.
Look, I think you clearly, if you're going to have reform of the electoral system, you need to have an independent election commission that's not going to be the servant.
Who should reform it?
Well, in the end, this is going to be the Afghan parliament and legislative process that has to reform it. But if it's not reformed, then the international community shouldn't pay for the elections. These elections were
Isn't that what happened with the United Nations supporting the past elections?
Well, the United Nations raised $300 million from Western taxpayers to pay for this election, and those people thought they were paying for an honest election, not a fraudulent one. There's going to be an election in May for Parliament with the same commission in charge. The election cannot be held unless the international community pays, and I think it would be absurd to pay unless you thought it was going to be an honest election. There's another point about these elections, though, that's so critical. This fraud has made the military mission much more difficult for the foreign troops. Since they don't have a credible local partner, they cannot accomplish their goals. As a result of the election, more money is being spent than would otherwise be spent, and people actually are dying because of it.
Did you want to come back on that?
I just want to ask, do you not think that anything can be done to improve the current government instead of trying to disregard it, because we know that it's so difficult to ensure fair and just elections?
Look, President Karzai has been in office for 8 years. It is truly hope over all reasonable experience to expect that in the next 5 years, it's somehow going to be better than it's been in the last 8 years, especially when the security situation is worse, and again, where he's now in office, where so many people see him as illegitimate.
Yeah, but it's not the people maybe like you, but the Afghan people don't see as illegitimate.
But the Afghan people didn't vote for him.
Well, no, but in the polls, they say that...
I'm sorry, but an election is a poll, Lawrence.
No,
it's a more
election is more
important
than a poll. Election is more... If you were afraid to vote because the Taliban might kill you, that makes it very difficult to vote. And then if you take a look at
that wasn't the problem. The problem was
that
the
was
people
part of the
manufacturing
problem.
votes.
That was part of the problem because in the areas they control, which normally would have supported Karzai, the people couldn't get to the polls, and they were afraid to go there.
They weren't allowed. The corrupt officials didn't even permit the polling places to exist. I mean, they just manufactured the votes.
In certain areas they did, but
massively,
not in all of them.
Millions of them.
No, they didn't.
Look at
Let me
Shorbat.
remind Mr. Galbraith, as I mentioned at the beginning, that this is not the first time that Karzai was been elected. This is the third time, not one. This is the third time. Before, during the transitional term, the second, first presidential election, and the third was that time.
The second election was the first election was a UN-run election and was reasonably fair. This election was run by the pro-Karzai Election Commission and was massively fraudulent. And there was every reason to expect that the Afghan people had become disillusioned with Karzai. We estimate, based on what the Election Commission, Complaints Commission staff tell me, that Karzai's real vote was about 41%.
I'm sorry, there's a difference between
35%.
talking about the Election Commission. I agree with you. I don't like them too. But when I'm talking about the people,
like them, but
they
what's
went
the point
to the
in
polling
having another
station.
election when they're in charge? If they're already discredited, another
People
election
are
with them
going
in
to the
charge.
polling station. This is the people of Afghanistan. The Election Commission, if they was pro-Karzai, why they announced the second round election? Because you dropped millions vote, 30% Karzai vote, you say it's about the fraud, and 20% Dr. Abdullah, you say it's a fraud vote. Even you add Ramazan Bashir, those also 20% the vote is just fraud. But there's a question. It's not legitimate to say from your address specifically, because if Afghans say it's illegitimate, it's acceptable for me. But for one person which is retired, is not Afghan, how you can talk? You should be responsible from your own work time and your office.
Okay, well, let him
After
answer.
that, you raised the issue
let him answer
why
that.
you didn't make a mechanism to be a fair
Shukriya
election,
Barakzai,
because
let
you
him
was
answer that.
responsible,
Okay.
not us.
First, let me be clear. It was my responsibility to be...
As an institution,
Would
because
you
I'm
let
not
him
taking
speak,
it
please?
personally.
It was the UN's responsibility and my responsibility to support honest elections. And since it was obvious that these elections were not going to be honest, the UN should have done more. I tried within the system as a good diplomat. I didn't go public. It was internal. There were profound disagreements. Ultimately, because of this, I was sacked. And so arguably, perhaps I should have resigned. Perhaps I should have gone public before the elections. Perhaps I didn't do enough. And so maybe you're right to blame me. But there was absolutely a systematic failure on the part of the United Nations. But in the end, the fraud that was committed wasn't committed by the United Nations. It was committed by the Afghan electoral institutions. And while you support President Karzai, there are many Afghans who did not support President Karzai, who do not see him as legitimate. Those people were disenfranchised by the result, and those people today are not supporting the government because they don't feel it represents them, because they didn't feel there was a fair election.
Okay, all right. Gentleman in the front row.
Good evening. I'm an American also. You bring up the point about legitimacy, and I think we should put that off the table for the moment. The bickering in Afghanistan's parliament, the problems with its ministers, they're arguing over a country that they don't have control over yet. You may bring up Iraq as being legitimate elections, but I guarantee if they could not secure their own borders, if they could not stabilize the country, regardless of how legitimate they would be, we would still be there.
Yeah, but look, if the government is not seen as legitimate by part of the population, then the government is not going to be able to take control of that area. And therefore...
Does that still go for the Taliban also? Is the Taliban legitimate? They obviously control parts of the country.
This isn't a contest between two forces for legitimacy. The Taliban use tactics, criminal tactics that the government, by and large, does not use. So that in order for the population to decide that they want to support the government, they have to put their lives at risk. And would you put your life at risk for a government that's in office by fraud, whose administration ranks 179 out of 180 on the Transparency International scale?
I would put my life at risk for a government that could protect me. Whether they're legitimate or not, the government that can protect me.
But if your government is ineffective, which this government has also been over 8 years, you're not going to risk your life to align with that government. Okay. And that's at the root of the problem.
Okay, all right.
Security, from my point of view, is not only physical security. We always should think about human security, which include physical security, mental security, delivering social services for the people, access for justice and stuff like that. These are important. But government try. Having security, it's quite difficult. Right now, Pakistan government with 500,000 soldiers cannot survive their own people's life. How, as a mature state, as a state which is not a post-conflict or conflict going on, as a state which is, they are not facing those problems which is we are facing today. If American wants to ask the state government about what's happened to their Trade Tower in 2001, it's not the lack of capacity from the government. Sometimes something is just going to happen. We are trying our best.
Thank you very much. And now we've reached the point, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to vote on the motion that this House believes this Afghan government is not worth fighting for. If you take your voting machines, let me just explain how they work. If you want to vote for the motion, that is the side represented by Peter Galbraith and Mirwais Yassini, you press button 1, the yes button. If you want to vote against the motion, the side represented by Shukriya Barakzai and Lawrence Korb, that's button 2, the no button. Whichever one you want to press, please do it now. Right, there it is. 51% for the motion, 49% against. The motion has been very narrowly carried.
But it was an honest vote.
But it was an honest vote. All it remains for me to do is to thank our distinguished speakers for coming. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to you, the audience, as well, for your questions. The Doha Debates will be back again next month. Till then, from all of us on the team, have a safe journey home. Good night. Thank you very much. Good night.